Under Bond, Policy and Operations, none submitted. Finance, Budget Report. Administration will update the board on the development of the district's 2016-17 budget. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay,
Mr.
while we're setting up, let me remind everyone as we continue to work through our budget discussions, regardless of the topic at this stage, these are conversation topics, they are informational topics, they are not decisions, nor are they set in stone. So it's to provide that foundational understanding of our budget and issues as we continue to look for a way to address the ongoing shortfall of support for public education in our state. So as we walk through this tonight, know that these are examples of possibilities. They are not the end-all by any means. More discussion to occur as we look at the implications as we move forward, but as we look for efficiencies and ways in which we can address the responsibility we have to prepare and for you to approve a balanced budget. We don't have any other option, and our revenues are been declining for a number of years in the areas that this board has control over. When we think of our entire budget, there are only certain portions of that budget that when revenue decreases, you have the ability to make decisions and to impact and develop that balanced budget. So with that reminder, I will go ahead and turn it over for a conversation tonight about transportation.
President Arnold, Superintendent Allison, members of the board, I get to introduce the presentation and be quiet. But I would want to indicate to you that one of the reasons we chose this one kind of to start with this phase of the information is there has been a tremendous amount of research and study done in this regard, and Darren and Fabian and the transportation team have done a fabulous job of putting this together. But and I would reiterate what Mr. Allison has said. There's no recommendations here. This is information for you, and you will, as we go through the presentation, you'll see there are some options that we'll be looking at for you to consider and think about. And then, of course, if at the end, if you have questions about any other aspect of budget development or that sort of thing after we finish this piece, I'd be happy to answer those questions. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Fabian.
Well, good evening, President Arnold, Superintendent Allison, and members of the board. I appreciate the opportunity to come up here and present tonight. As we all know, transportation is a large chunk of the budget, and I think obviously comes up quite often, especially during these times. So we wanted to come up and give you a brief background of kind of how we operate, because it's a very complicated operation, and also bring some ideas and some research that we've done over the last few years. So with that said, we're going to give you a little background as to our department and what we do. We ensure the safe transport of over 18,000 kids in our community, or just under 18,000 kids. Since 2011, we've reduced the number of routes and buses that we utilize from a high of 531 in 2011 down to a high of 479. So it's been about a 50 bus reduction that we've had over the last 5 years. Some of it I can't take credit for. There were some programmatic changes that ended, like NCLB, and those obviously we were able to capitalize on. But a lot of it I also commend my team for doing some great efficiency work. We work with First Student on a regular basis, trying to figure out ways to restructure runs to be able to minimize the amount of buses that we utilize. And so there has been a drastic reduction in terms of the amount of buses that we utilize. In our system, we operate under what is called a 3-tier system, meaning that buses serve a 7 o'clock, an 8 o'clock, and a 9 o'clock school. And I'll go briefly into more detail later on to give you a better explanation of that. We pay for buses by the day. So basically, a bus, we pay the same whether it serves 1 tier or 3 tiers. And so the ultimate goal for maximum efficiency is for a bus to be able to serve 3 tiers. And roughly 45.3% of our buses do that. They serve all 3 tiers, so they serve a 7, an 8, and a 9 o'clock school. About 50% of our buses are double-tiered, meaning that they serve 2 schools. And then 3.9% of our buses are single-tiered, meaning that they serve 1 school. A large majority of those are buses that we utilize at our special needs centers. Levy, for example, we require that we pick up staff to ride buses. And because of that, we can't get that run done within a 40-minute period of time, and we can't pair those buses with something else. So that's why they're single-tiered. You've seen this graphic before, but I wanted to bring it back to you so you can see this illustration exactly how it works and how it operates. So there's a bus on the screen, and that particular bus represents one of our daily buses that would leave the lot in the morning and drive around and pick up kids. I wanted to sing the wheels on the bus, but I figured it'd be too much. Drives around, picks up students, and then drops them off at their first tier. Again, they start picking up kids at 6:05. They drop off at 6:45, 15 minutes before to give students enough time to get in, eat breakfast if they want, and then make it to class by 7 o'clock. Then that same bus leaves, travels around, picks up students again, and then makes it to its next tier, which is their 8 o'clock school. Again, pickup time is 7:05 to 7:45. They get to school at 7:45. And then that same bus leaves, picks up students, and then goes and delivers them at Spate Magnet. So this is a perfect example of a triple tier route. Now there is a difference between a route and a run. A route is the combination of all 3 of those trips. So a combination, the entire ride for the bus in the morning is a route, meaning its trip to Brooks, Marshall, and Spate combined is what we call a route. A run is an individual trip. So a run would be the trips, the pickup to Brooks. That's one run. Then the second run would be the Marshall trips. So that is the difference. Some key things to remember here. As you can tell, the longest that any of our students are on a bus is 40 minutes. So from the earliest pickup to when we drop off is 40 minutes. Our average student, and I've calculated this because we had to do some reports this week, our average student rides about 21 minutes each way a day. So about 42 minutes, 21 minutes in the morning, 21 minutes in the afternoon. Another thing to remember is because we run on a triple tier system, there's some efficiencies. I think we've all received phone calls of patrons complaining because we have buses running with 3 kids. And yes, when we have 40 minutes to pick up students, sometimes when we're traveling from the northwest part of the city to drop off at Northeast Magnet, you can only pick up 1 or 2 kids and to get them to school within that 40-minute period of time. But that same bus that picked up 3 kids at the first tier can be full at the second tier and pick up a full 50 kids, and can be full again at the third tier and pick up another 50 kids. So the reality is, even though some buses, yes, you're seeing with 3 kids, that's not how that bus will run, and that's not the number of kids it transports for the entire day. It could transport 80, it could transport 100 for that matter. So those are some things to remember. So that's an example of a morning route. Another thing to remember is we pair our buses as efficiently as possible. So this particular run, as you can tell, had 2 regular ed runs, and that middle run is a special ed run. We take the daily amount that we pay for that bus, divide it by 3. We charge 1/3 to special ed, and then 2/3 of it would be charged to my regular ed budget. There are districts that separate this completely, and so they run fleets on regular ed only and special ed only. But then you have to double the number of drivers. So this allows us to have some flexibility to be able to pair more efficiency. There are also districts that contract out the regular ed services but keep special ed in-house. But when you do that, you, again, have to double the number of mechanics that you utilize. You have to double the number of drivers that you need. So it creates a larger cost. So this is a pretty efficient system that we're running. So as we move forward, a little bit more about transportation. The daily cost per bus is the same whether a bus serves 1 tier or whether we serve 3 tiers. Our annual cost for a minibus is around $36,105. Our annual cost for a large bus is about $41,082. The total number of routes is primarily determined by the largest tier. So whatever start time that we have the largest number of buses on, that is what's going to mandate our cost. And you'll see, as we move forward, you'll get to see that in action, because that's key as you look at transportation savings. And again, our midday trips, alternative vehicles, and shuttles that we run are an additional cost. So our pre-K trips in the middle of the day, those cost us approximately $43 a trip. So as we have more discussions, and when you think about moving to, or when we're thinking about, looking at kindergarten being half day, we would have to add some buses or some transportation costs for that, if that were to happen for the midday, because we would need buses to take students home midday and then bring them in the afternoon too. So it's something else to think about that could drive this cost up. So as we look at the data, this is why we transport students. 6,200, a little bit above that, we transport to neighborhood schools because of distance. We transport about 4,700 for magnet. We transport about 1,600 for special education. We have about 3,100 that we actually transport for hazardous. And I want you to keep this number in mind, because it's going to look a little bit different, and I'll explain the difference as we move forward in the presentation. And then there's a wide array of other reasons why we transport other students. The number at the bottom is really key to understanding this whole piece. That's the number of buses that we're utilizing at each tier. So for our 7 o'clock schools, which are our secondary magnets, we're utilizing about 213 buses. For our 8 a.m. schools, we're utilizing about 465. And for our 9 a.m. schools, we're utilizing about 459. Again, our largest tier is the one that mandates the number of buses that we're going to utilize. So that second tier, that 465, is a key number. That's the one that's driving everything. In an ideal world, those 3 buses would be balanced, or those 3 tiers would be balanced. So we would have 3 tiers of roughly 400 buses apiece, and then we would end up with a balanced fleet and a significant reduction in the number of buses. But that would mean that some schools that are currently at 9 and 8 o'clock would have to move to a different start time to be able to balance them out. Another key point to make in this slide is, if you look at our start times, you look at 7 a.m., you have your secondary magnets. You look at 8 a.m., you have your secondary neighborhood schools, and then you look at 9 a.m., you have your elementary schools. There's been a lot of discussion about magnet transportation and about how cutting magnet transportation would help us reduce the number of buses. But if you look at our largest tier, it's our neighborhood schools. So we could cut magnet transportation altogether, but all of our schools, our largest tier is our second tier, which is our neighborhood schools. So the only savings that you would see if you cut magnet transportation would be our 2K8s that are magnet schools that are 8 o'clock, which would be Gordon Parks and Horace Mann. So those would be your only savings. So you would take away transportation for 4,700 kids, but your only savings would be those buses that are currently at Horace Mann and Gordon Parks. So that's a little bit of an explanation as to the tiers and where we go. So as we looked at transportation and some of the efficiencies and some pieces, we do have policy 7330, which is the provision for hazardous transportation. This is a policy that we've briefly looked at in the past, but this policy is the one that mandates hazardous busing. AIP2 is the one that highlights the criteria required for an area to be deemed as hazardous, and I'll go over AIP2 in a second. If all criteria within a particular subsection are in place, meaning all of the criteria in 2A are in place, then the area would qualify for hazardous. If all the criteria in 2B are in there, then the area would be deemed hazardous. But it doesn't have to be a combination of 2A, 2B, and 2C. It just has to be all of the criteria within a particular subsection. And I'll go through each subsection individually. This policy does not also apply to high school students. So although policy states that we could do it as space available busing, but the policy does not cover high school. But as a practice over the last several years, we have been extending hazardous transportation to high school students. So we are transporting all students under 2.5 miles to Heights, and we have also done it at Northeast Magnet. Also, if there is an alternative path available that is under 2.5 miles that does not meet the hazardous criteria, the area will be deemed as hazardous, meaning it doesn't have to be the most direct path. If the most direct path is hazardous, but there's a way to go around that that is not hazardous and is under 2.5, then the area would not qualify for hazardous. So let's look at each subsection. 2A is the one that defines walk path, and it states that basically in order for an area to qualify for hazardous, students would be required to walk on roadways where the posted speed limit is 40 miles per hour or more, other than on crossing at lights or an intersection, and there are no surfaces or walk paths in order to walk safely. So basically, a student would need to walk in the actual road of a street that's over 40 miles per hour in order to be able to qualify for hazardous. Again, the city has made significant improvements. There's a lot of areas. This doesn't necessarily say that you need a sidewalk. If there is grass on the side of the road that students can walk on, and there's a lot of neighborhoods that don't have sidewalks, but students can walk on grass, and the area is not deemed as hazardous. It doesn't necessarily mean sidewalk. It just means that you would have to walk on the road. So like, for example, bar ditches, and you have to walk on the road because there's a bar ditch, then that would mean the area is hazardous. The second is intersections, and again, all of the following must apply. Students would be required to cross 4 or more consecutive lanes of traffic where the posted speed limit is 40 miles per mile or more, and there is an absence of a pedestrian-controlled or automatically controlled crosswalk. I can tell you that the city has made vast improvements, and if you think of most major intersections in the city, there is a button or a pedestrian-controlled crosswalk somewhere that can be pressed in order for students to get across. And I think that's the biggest difference from years ago when there were a lot of hazardous areas to where we're at now. And then and the policy also speaks that there must be a heavy traffic flow of 32,000 vehicles or more. Now, we've looked everywhere to find where this heavy traffic flow definition comes from. We've even called the city, and no one can tell us where it came from. So that 32,000 figure, although we can get the number of cars that travel in an intersection, the city, as far as we know, doesn't have that definition of a heavy traffic flow. So we're not quite sure where that came from. But you'll see that this policy has been in existence since 1974, so that may have something to do with it. As we look at the 2C, that's railroad crossings, and that would mean that students would be required to cross 2 or more adjacent railroad tracks where the posted speed limit is 40 miles per hour or more. There is an absence of a pedestrian-controlled or automatically controlled crosswalk, and there's moderate or heavy traffic flow of 23,000 vehicles or more. Again, we don't know where that number came from again. But there are very few railroad crossings where you have 2 or more adjacent railroads that are active without any sort of a sidewalk. And the perfect example would be probably 29th Street and Broadway. You have all those railroad tracks there. That area would be deemed as hazardous, but it's an industrial area and no kids are walking through that. So it technically doesn't apply, but that would be an example of an area. But there aren't very many areas like that where railroad crossings would apply. And finally, the last one is 2D, which is bridges, and we're lumping overpasses under bridges because they fall under the same category, even policy doesn't speak to that. And this where students are required to cross bridges where there is no pedestrian walkway. And as we look at a lot of our bridges and overpasses, most of them have, and a lot of them have sidewalks or walkways. So a little bit more about the hazardous policy. Again, it's been in place since 1974, before I was born. Currently, there are 34 hazardous areas from which 3,711 students reside. There is no detailed history that was kept on each one of the areas. We do have information on some of them, and I can tell you that some of them were legitimately hazardous and are legitimately hazardous, and that's how they came about. Some were done because we closed schools and we grandfathered students to their new school and we transported, and we just kept doing it. Others were done, I think the state did a funding for like a level 2 hazardous transportation in the 90s, mid to late 90s, and so they funded additional transportation for hazardous. They took that funding away the next year, but we never took it away. So it's stayed on since then. Over the years, the city has made significant improvements for pedestrians, including the additional sidewalks, walk paths, including overpasses and underpasses. They've also added pedestrian-controlled features at major intersections, and you see those all over the city. And there are also additional mid-block crosswalks throughout the city that they've added. The current hazardous policy application has led to some inconsistencies. Although when we did the boundary changes, we did look at the hazardous policy, especially as we looked at some areas and deemed and applied the policy at that point. But there are a lot of areas in our city that no longer meet the hazardous criteria. So again, this is a perfect example of a little bit of the inconsistencies that we have in terms of the hazardous policy. You have two boundaries that you're seeing, Dodge Elementary and Gammon Elementary. Both of them have some major highways that travel in the middle of their boundaries. Dodge Elementary has 235 that travels, and then Gammon has K96. So as you look at both of those areas, all of the kids, so those are very similar, kids underpasses. But all of the kids, but the Dodge Elementary area, which has been that way for years, is not considered hazardous. So those kids, and if you think at that intersection of Central and 235, which is a pretty busy intersection, kids that live west of 235 are currently walking in that underpass and are currently getting to school. Yet the students at Gammon Elementary that live north of K96 are currently receiving transportation due to hazardous busing, yet they're walking under, or the situation, the similarities are exactly the same conditions. Some of it could be due to the fact that there's been some significant improvements in the last few years in that Woodlawn area in K96, and the same thing could be said of Rock Road. But there are numerous examples of situations like this throughout the city where there are students that are walking under some conditions, yet students in other parts of the city are receiving transportation due to hazardous, and the same conditions are in place in both sides. So we put together, because we knew that transportation is a hot topic, it tends to be from time to time because it comes up often. A few years back, we put together a Policies and Procedures Committee that is comprised of building administrators and USD 259 support staff. And we went to Bill and Alicia and asked them to provide us the names of some administrators, and some of them were selected because they are principals in some of these areas. The primary goal of this committee was to look at current transportation policies and procedures and practices and recommend changes to address efficiencies. As part of their work, we analyzed hazardous areas in detail, and we surveyed each area. We had them look at data, so we looked at numbers, we had them look at boundary maps, we even took field trips where we had buses come to our meetings, and we loaded up on a bus, and we all went on a field trip and looked at some of these areas that we knew were somewhat questionable. So we did some very in-depth, detailed looking at these hazardous areas. And so here are some of their analysis results. Of the current 34 current schools that offer hazardous transportation, 12 schools would keep hazardous busing, including the 2 high schools. 12 schools have partial hazardous areas, meaning they lose some of it, but some other areas still qualify. And 10 schools no longer meet the hazardous criteria. Based on current data, of the 3,711 students that currently live in those areas, and yes, I told you that to refer back to the 3,100, this number is higher than the 3,100 that I listed earlier. The 3,100 is the kids that we actually transport. The 3,700 is the kids that live and attend these schools, but obviously about 500 of them are currently getting their own selves to school. But of those 3,700 kids that currently live in those areas, 2,185 would no longer qualify for transportation, and 1,526 would continue to qualify. This does not mean that we're making any changes to policy. It is simply looking at applying the current hazardous policy as it is. When you look at what the impact to buses, and this is the interesting part, and this is where the tierings come into place, the reduction of buses means that 2 buses could be eliminated at the second tier, which is our highest. The remainder of those buses, the remaining 36 buses, would be eliminated at the third tier. So that means that really the total reductions to our entire fleet would only be 2 buses because of the tiers. And you can look at that in this next graphic. As you can see, we have our tier distribution again. You have 460 buses, which is our highest at the second tier. But if we reduce those 2 buses at the second tier, that would be your only savings, which would be, it would take our fleet down by 2 buses to 463. The savings, and I want to make it very clear because I think we had some confusion earlier, the savings is depending on what type of a bus we're able to save. So if we're able to save a minibus, our savings will be $72,210. If we're able to save 2 big buses, the savings would be $82,164. The reality is it will be a range, so somewhere in the middle, depending on what works best with pairings. So that's why I put both numbers on there, but don't think that we're saving $150,000 because that's not the case. It's a range between those 2 numbers. And then there would probably be an additional $38,000 or so in terms of fuel, because we are estimating that right now with current fuel prices as cheap as they are, which is nice, we're thinking about $1,000 per run that we're able to eliminate because we are able to save fuel. So when we looked at this, obviously the savings aren't significant. So we knew that we had to do an analysis to look beyond and look at the potential distribution of our tiers. And that's what we decided. So in order to maximize savings, the implementation of the hazardous policy needs to be tied to bell time changes to lower the second tier. Again, these are just ideas. Nothing is final. We just want to look at some possibilities. So when we looked at our second tier, which is our highest, we looked at groupings of particular schools that we felt might be a good possibility to be moved up to the first tier. So moving them from an 8 o'clock start time to a 7 o'clock start time. And these are the schools that we looked at as possibilities. And I'll explain the numbers a little bit because I know it looks confusing. First, I want to clarify that 484 is higher than the 465 that I'd previously listed. That is because we are expecting about a 19 bus increase due to the separation of Southeast High School and Curtis Middle School. So we're expecting a 19 bus increase. So the number of buses that we're going to have were things to be exactly the same next school year and Southeast be at its new location and Curtis remain at its current location, we would have 484 buses at the second tier because there are 8 o'clock schools. So in order for us to get to that magical number of 423, which is really where our third tier is at, where the reductions are at, we looked at a combination of ways to get to that number. So we looked at potentially the K-8s as moving to 7 o'clock, Robinson Middle School, which Robinson Middle School operates somewhat as a neighborhood magnet right now because of their IB program. We're transporting students all over the city because of their pre-IB program, yet they have their own neighborhood. So they have 28 buses, which is a significant amount. So they would be like Jardine, which Jardine right now is a 7 o'clock school. It is a neighborhood magnet. And then we looked at our special programs. Again, nothing is set in stone. The key here is as you look at on your screens right now in the blue. Looking at moving those. Right now with that chart, the way that it looks, it looks like we want to reduce by 148 buses. The reality is that we need to reduce by 61 buses in order at the second tier, in order for us to be able to balance our tiers and get down to that magic 423 bus number that we need to get to in order to maximize our savings. Does that make sense? So we're going to look at each one of these individually, so that way you can see what the what the savings would be for each one of these subsections. First is our K-8s, in moving the K-8 start time to a 7 o'clock. This is strictly from a numbers perspective. Really, like I mentioned earlier, our K-8s are our only magnet schools that we have at the 8 o'clock time period, so that's partially why we looked at it. Gordon Parks is a neighborhood magnet, Horace Mann is a pure magnet, and it is the only pure magnet that we have at the 8 o'clock start time. We put McAuliffe in there because it's also a K-8, but also because it has the same start time at Southeast. So when we're looking at the McAuliffe boundary, we're looking at picking up students from both McAuliffe and Southeast High School at the same exact time. And so you're looking at the possibility of students, kindergarten through 12th grade, congregating in the same corners for two different types of buses, which is interesting, and it creates, certainly the first day of school, I could see us having some kindergartners show up at Southeast High School because they got on the wrong buses. As we look at them, when we look at students, large populations of students congregating in the same corners, that is partially why this one's there.
I think that would only happen if our transportation director was not doing his job,
Well,
correct?
well, I'll take credit for that one.
All right. Just check.
I'll take it. So again, we have the high 484 number, which is different than the 465. 484 would be where we would be at the second tier. We want to get to that 423 number. Doing all of these combined would get us to 417 at the second tier, meaning that our third tier will become our largest. You're looking at a savings range for those 42 buses of between 1.5 million and 1.7 million, on top of the 38 million in fuel that you're savings from the hazardous. This is all tied together, hazardous and those changes. Again,
I think you meant to say 38,000, not 38 million.
oh, 38,000, sorry. Okay. Yes, that's a big number, 38,000. We wouldn't be saving any additional fuel aside from hazardous, because remember that we would still be running those buses. We would just be running them at 7 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock, so we would still need that fuel. So your savings in fuel is only for the elimination of hazardous. And again, I do want to make clear that these savings at 1.5 to 1.7 million is based on our current budget. So it's a reduction from our current budget.
And I would like to also indicate here, when we're looking at the savings that are here, when we're including the Southeast Curtis piece, that also then eliminates the cost increase that was on my other page. Because the cost increase on the other page was all predicated on some of those additional routes that we're going to have to be put in there. So when we're looking at the 1.5, 1.7 plus the 38,000, that actually is another significant amount higher, because the cost increase also goes away in terms of our calculations. So, and that carries through all of these estimates that he has here.
Which simply means that our target budget cut number would decrease.
The top end of it was about $1 million. The bottom end was about around 100,000 or something like that.
So this is the K-8s and moving them to 7 o'clock. Then we looked at Robinson individually. Again, it operates like a neighborhood magnet, and potentially looking at Robinson to move to a first-tier school. 484 again, our high would become 454. So you're looking at about 11 bus reduction. So the range would be between 397,000 and 451,000, plus your 38,000 in fuel that you're still saving for hazardous. I mean, it has to be a range, again, because I can't tell you what buses or mini buses that would be eliminated in large buses. It just depends on our parents and exactly how it works. And then the final one is our special programs, and looking at our special programs. That would be Chisholm Life, Gateway, Griffinstein, Sowers, and Wells. Again, that would mean a reduction of about 55 buses at the second tier. Our second tier would remain our highest still at 429. but you're still looking at a significant savings of about 36 buses at around 1.3 million to 1.5 million, somewhere in that range, and your 38,000 in fuel again. So I wanted to bring this back to center again and bring you this slide, because it doesn't have to be all of the K-8s, or it wouldn't have to be Robinson, or it wouldn't have to be all the special schools. You could do any combination of these to get to your magic 61 bus reduction at the second tier for us to be able to maximize efficiency. As we had some discussions about this and we thought more about it, this would also allow us to look at some potential programmatic start times that we have, problematic start times that we have, or conflicting, that may make things easier on our families and our schools. When you think about Caldwell and being next to Curtis, right now Caldwell is a 9 o'clock school, Curtis is an 8 o'clock school. So parents that live in that area currently have the hardship of dropping off students at 2 different start times, which creates some difficulties. So the potential of moving start times could also mean that we could look at some of those things, to look at maybe moving some of those schools that are close to one another to a closer start time to make it easier on the families that live in those areas. So there's potential beyond what you see here. Questions about this? Yes, ma'am?
Actually, I'm going to start. Cheryl, were you adding? I see it now. Okay.
And I do have one last slide, so I don't know if you wanted me to finish, or we take these as we go along.
That might be good. Is that okay, Joy?
Okay.
Is that okay, Cheryl? We'll let you go ahead and finish, and then.
So as we looked at the committee that we put together, they did make some suggestions in terms of if the change was to be implemented, as far as what they felt would need to happen. And this was primarily from a building administrator perspective. The first was that changes needed to be implemented at the beginning of the school year. We all know we wouldn't do this mid-year, but that was a big thing that those administrators wanted us to look at. Other things that they wanted is they wanted general information about the change, that it should be shared with principals prior to notices being sent to parents. They also wanted meetings for us to have with those administrators that are impacted to happen. And this is why. We know that the bus reduction could mean less behavior issues on buses, could mean there's less buses parked in front of their buildings, but we also know that we'll be adding some other challenges, including parent traffic. There are some schools that would lose pretty much all of their buses, which means a larger population of cars that are dropping off their students. So they really want us to look at, strategize with them as far as what we need to do in terms of drop-off procedures and those pieces in order to be able to accommodate some of those challenges. They also wanted some talking points to be provided to them about how to address this. They also felt that notices should be sent out to all impacted families in the spring, and they wanted that schools that were to be impacted to offer parent meetings in which the following information would be shared. First, the budget impact that led to the change. They felt that doing a policy explanation to this was critical. And the last piece was sharing geographical information about their boundary so that parents could start looking at walk paths and looking and discussing that with their children. So again, these were additional recommendations that came from that committee as far as looking at the change and moving forward with that. So with that, that is really the end of my presentation, and I look forward to the questions.
Okay, I'm going to start. Those students that qualify for hazardous, they're only, you put them in one category, either or. It's not, they're over 2.5 miles and hazardous. It's
only the students that live under 2.5 miles qualify for hazardous transportation. Any student that lives over 2.5 miles from their assigned school, or their magnet school, or their base school, we transport. We already transport.
That's kind of what I was wondering. So since we have had all of the improvements and changes made by the city, then I assume this is up to date current with,
This data is current as of December, at least the student information as of December of this year.
okay. Now, again, on the hazardous, do we have any idea how far, like, average miles from school that these students would live, or?
It varies. I can probably get that data pull as far as the average student is, but I think, again, we go back to the issues that there are currently neighborhood students that walk as much as 2.49 miles to school and do not qualify for transportation because they don't live in a hazardous area, and those students are getting themselves to school. You know, so when you look at a distance piece, yeah, we can get it calculated and I can bring it to you, but there are a lot of students under the same conditions that are currently getting themselves to school.
Okay. Now, the other question kind of steps away from this. When we eliminated forced busing, did that have an impact on transportation at all? Do you know?
It had an impact at the elementary level, but we are still offering choice to those families in that area. And because there's that choice component, we're still having buses go to that area and pick up students. The difference is that we're picking up less students now because there's less students exercising that choice.
Okay. I'm going to share the questions. I might circle back around, but Joy, you're next up.
Thank you, and thanks to your committee for their work. It sounds like you guys have really poured over field trips and the whole bit, so appreciate that. I have a couple of questions just to understand a few things in your presentation. So I heard you mention that there will be additional buses because the Southeast Curtis separation, but I'm not sure that I understand what that means. So could you explain that a little bit?
Currently, Curtis and Southeast students ride the same buses. So we are currently, they operate as one school, and we drop students off and pick them up in the parking lot between both schools. And so they're utilizing the same buses. With the separation of both schools, now Curtis is going to need their own share of buses, and then we'll need the buses at Southeast.
Right. So currently we have 6th through 12th graders possibly on the same bus. That's just a little frightening. Okay. The second question I have for you is, I'm sure your staff is handling that very well, however, since we haven't had any problems. Before I was on the board, there was a discussion about moving Southeast High School out where its new location is, and there was a discussion about whether to extend hazardous busing to those students as well. Does this proposal, or it's not really a proposal, do these numbers at all reflect that? Is that what the part of the plus 19?
Yes, they do.
Okay. So when it says hazardous would in the list of things to the 2 high schools, it would actually be 3 moving forward? Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. And then since we're adding 19 buses, will that also increase our fuel, or will it be the same fuel cost?
The 19 buses would be about $1,000 per bus on fuel would be, so it would be about $19,000.
Okay.
And that would be per run.
And just a point of clarification, the 19 bus estimate would be if 100% of the Southeast Curtis split were transported. So we know that number at this point in time is realistically probably too high in the number of buses.
Okay.
And this is unofficial at this point, but asking at Southeast through their advisory periods to gauge how many students anticipated of freshmen, sophomores, and current juniors would be riding the bus to Southeast, their response was about 50%. So that number is going to fluctuate when we actually get to that point in time. It's probably not going to be 19, but I don't think it's going to be 8 either. So as we continue to refine and get better information, we can adjust that number a little bit, if that helps.
That does help. Thank you. And then I'm just throwing this out to ask the question, but you mentioned that students ride the bus an average of 21 minutes, and that the length of time that they're on the bus is 40 minutes or less. Has there been any research done into if we increase that by 5 minutes, the average time was 26 minutes on the bus? Would that help us much?
We've looked at it in the past, but it would also mean a significant change to the bell times, because then that means that some schools would have to start earlier in order to keep the tiers balanced, and you have to add that to the beginning, middle, and end. So there would have to be a significant adjustment to the bell times in order for that to.
Yeah, when we think about needing an hour difference between each of the tiers so that we can drop students off, get back to where their next route is, pick them up. So by doing that, then we need more than an hour per tier to adjust that.
So you could be looking at your elementary school starting at 9:30 in the morning, because we need that more time in between.
Okay, that helps. Thanks for that. And then I guess my last question might be more for Superintendent Allison, but do we have any good data about how this might impact attendance? Or, I've read a lot of research over the years that one of the times where middle school students get in trouble is between the time school is out and the time their parents get home. So a lot of the schools on the list for moving start times are around middle schools, and so we're adding an hour into that. Have we had any thought or discussion about how we might help with the after-school programs or something in order to help mitigate that for families?
Not any significant conversation as we look at all of that, and you can look at that information. You can also look at information around start times based on age and sleep, and that research tells you that elementary ought to be your earliest tier and high school is your latest tier. So we've got a little bit of bits and pieces as we look at the research on what would be best, but that would be something we could definitely consider if our middle school start times for some of those did move, would be to work with principals and see if they had some ideas, because we do have some of the extracurriculars after school and how that would play out, but we haven't done any real significant conversation around those at this point.
Okay. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your presentation. And Darren, they didn't let you speak at all.
I'm waiting for the right opportunity.
First time.
It will
If he does, it probably adds 15 slides to the presentation. So we wanted to.
I'm on my best behavior this evening.
Okay. Cheryl?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions about the hazardous busing. It's my understanding that the hazardous busing is a policy for the district. It is not mandated by the state. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And our equity issue, you showed us one example of equity where Dodge students and Gammon students had similar kinds of barriers with major highways. Dodge does not get transportation. Gammon does. Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea of how many other schools might qualify? Or is this a lone example, or are we looking at multiple examples?
There are multiple examples because there are areas that, based on city improvements, are no longer deemed hazardous.
Okay, so really we're looking at bringing our schools into compliance with our policy that's been around for a long time.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's been what the committee has taken a great deal of time to do, is to analyze each of the hazardous. Does it still meet the criteria? Yes, no. And then to also look at, are there other areas based on that criteria that might need to be classified as hazardous that are not currently. So they did a lot of work looking at the maps, the field trips. Mr. Musey would not allow food or drink on the buses when we did those field trips, but they spent a great deal of time making sure that we did exactly that.
Actually, he was the rebel. I was the one that was saying no.
Yeah. I got in trouble because I tried to bring a drink onto the bus. But looking at those aspects, because it had been, as we went back to look at some of these, we could not really determine the last time that there had been an updated assessment. So as crosswalks were added, as you know, the light changes, the mid-street crosswalks, so many of those improvements that were made, sidewalks added, which changed some of that criteria. So it really was a lot of work by the committee. I don't think they realized when they agreed to be on it what it was going to involve. But over the last 24 months, to do exactly that, to make sure we're in compliance, and then to go from this point as we look forward, and how are we going to continue to do that and make sure that as changes occur, we stay in compliance with the policy.
Right.
And we continuously analyze the data. I mean, we have added some areas recently that we deemed as hazardous based that didn't meet the criteria. Jardine, their previous area was only tied to their neighborhood, but as we looked at their magnet boundary, there were kids that lived under 2.5 miles that were considered or walking under hazardous conditions, so we added that area. So we've looked at the implementation, and what you have here in the presentation is the most up to date as far as what we currently have and what would end.
And thank you to you and your committee for doing that, because I think it's something that's well overdue to look at. I know Stuckey, when we opened it, we had no sidewalks around it. We still don't. But at some point in time, we will have sidewalks because that community's growing so fast. And that may change as well. But we're really, as a board, looking at two separate issues here. One is the hazardous issue, which we need to make a decision about. And then driving that is the reduction of buses in our middle tier, because we'd only save 2 buses with hazardous, and we'd save $38,000 in fuel. So that really isn't the issue of our budget problem, although it is a separate issue, correct?
Yes, but yeah, the implementation of the hazardous policy leaves some room there with bell time changes for reduction in the number of buses to help us with budget.
Yeah, because that was the second half of your presentation. My question on that part is, you looked very carefully at moving schools to the 7 a.m. time, and I understand why, because that's our least used time. But did we also look, is there any need to do any shuffling with the 9 a.m. schools? Moving a school from an 8 to a 9, is there something magical about 61 buses?
There is, because our third tier, hold on. Our third tier would become our largest at 423. So if we're adding schools to the 9 o'clock tier, we'll be adding to our
That
largest
number.
tier. Yeah. So we would actually, moving schools to 9 o'clock would actually increase the number of buses that we would need rather than reducing.
Okay. And that's your whole thinking behind just moving to 7?
Up to 7. The only way it would be is we would move 9s to 7 too, but that would also be a significant move for those elementary kiddos.
And I assume that you're meeting with building principals and getting feedback, et cetera, on all of these. I know you're good at doing that, so I assume that's happening.
Yeah, we'll be working through all of that.
And what you will, I guess my question is, will you be bringing this back to us with a recommendation of what we do?
Yes, that'll depend on the board's direction as we move through. This is the information piece. As we begin to process through other aspects of the budget, then if the board asks for administrative recommendations, we would definitely bring back some possibilities.
Okay, because it doesn't look like we have to do every single one of these to get where we want to be.
No, just to get to that 61 number.
Yeah. We can only make a few people mad instead of everybody, right? Thank you. That was a good presentation. I understand it much more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lynn?
Okay, I'd like to ask some questions, clarification. Under the old funding formula, we were paid for transportation for special ed about an 80% reimbursement.
Yes.
And then for regular ed over 2.5 miles, we were reimbursed about 50%. Is that correct?
50 to 60%, depending on.
Okay, that changed a little bit and all those kind of things. And again, if I understand the new block grants, that all that money got wrapped into the new block grants, and technically, we're not being paid or reimbursed for transportation any longer.
The special ed remained the same.
Special ed stays,
right.
okay.
But the general fund part of it, no, it got all rolled into the block grant, so there is no calculation for transportation per se.
Okay, so if the block grants ever go away, and they've made tremendous progress on that this year. Notice the sarcasm in my voice. We may be with that for a while. But if they do change the funding formula, they may or they may not put transportation into that funding formula. At this point, we don't know. Right?
Correct. At this point, we don't know. The conversations that I've had with some of the legislators would indicate to me that if they go back to a school finance formula that has those types of calculations in it, that would be inserted back in.
And that makes sense. Particularly most legislators don't think about busing in Wichita. They think about busing for rural, country schools, those kinds of things. So that makes a big difference. And again, if I understand it correctly, I just want to be clear, is that we can charge a fee for busing under 2.5 miles, but not for over 2.5 miles.
Correct.
So, the magnets and those kind of things that people have asked us to do, that would be the difficulty of doing that. So, okay.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to get that clear. I guess the thought overall was that, these changes will be painful if it affects your child and your school. I mean, I don't think there's any doubts about that. That's going to be a change for families. And I guess one of the things I'd like to say on that is, we're looking at all these things. None of them are our making, but we do want to see what can be the least painful for our community. So, we've got to weigh in this one as opposed to what it could do to staff, what it could do to, other cuts could do to staff and things like that. So, so I guess I'm formulating in my mind, how I'll be responding to each one of these. I haven't quite figured that out yet, but I do think that's something that we need to discuss at some point in time, is how do we want to approach these things down the road. There are no easy answers, so we're going to have to really kind of struggle through these. So I do appreciate the information. That really helps us, kind of weigh back and forth what are the possibilities.
Okay. The one follow-up and final follow-up that I have, just in looking at the total number of buses impacted from hazardous, it's like 38 buses. And if you're looking for 61, then it's like 23 buses left, or 23 that we'd have to figure in. So it looks like a combination of hazardous and bell time would get us to that. So I really would like to have you bring back your recommendations on exactly what it would look like and how we would impact that. I think that it would be ideal if we actually, I'm looking at board members to be sure that they're in agreement, that we have an idea of specifically how many will be impacted by the change, and we can go from there. So, John, if we could have you bring back your recommendations?
Yes, I would anticipate we'd bring that back as part of a package of recommendations, not as a standalone, just for the standpoint that as we talk about 61 buses, that maximizes our savings. So if we did less than that, it just means less potential savings that will have to be found some other place. So, bringing that as we move forward in some phases for you to look at, so that you get kind of a bigger picture on how each of them has a domino effect on one decision to the next versus just as a standalone will absolutely do.
And I think that's fine. However you decide to do that, it would give the board an opportunity to look at this as one of the viable pieces. So we'll leave that to your discretion, how and when that's brought back. But thank you all for a great and informative presentation. And despite the curveballs that he was throwing, you did good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, we're ready for our next item.